الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد، فيا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful. And I ask Him to send an abundance of peace and blessings and praise upon our beloved Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I remind myself and I remind you on this blessed day of Jumu'ah of the kalima of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Every Friday I remind myself of the moment that I chose Islam. It doesn't matter if I was born into a Muslim family or I was born into a non-Muslim family. There was a point in my life, and there's a point in your life, where you decide, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And every Friday, we should remind ourselves of that moment. I also remind myself and I remind you on this blessed day of Jumu'ah to send an abundance of peace and blessings upon the beloved Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We are 4 weeks out from Ramadan, and there is a noticeable decline in how we feel. In the month of Ramadan, we feel the masjid is muzdahim. There is so many people here at the masjid. Our hearts feel full. We feel and taste a sweetness, a happiness, a joy that comes with the month of Ramadan. That sweetness, that flavor, that happiness, that joy is not limited to the month of Ramadan. I know for many of us, we think to ourselves, there are seasons of worship. There's Ramadan and Dhul Hijjah and the days of the reminder of the Isra and Mi'raj, etc. There are these seasons of worship. But that flavor that you taste in Ramadan, you can taste outside of the month of Ramadan. The Prophet ﷺ shared with us a hadith in which he said, ثَلَاثٌ مَنْ كُنَّ فِيهِ وَجَدَ حَلَاوَةَ الْإِيمَانِ. There are three things that if you have these three things, you will taste that beautiful flavor of belief. The first, أن يكون الله ورسوله أحب إليه مما سواهما. That you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger more than anything else. The second, وأن يحب المرء لا يحبه إلا لله. That you love your brother simply because they believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That you love your brother not because they gave me a discount, or they did this for me, or they did that for me, they checked in on me when I was sick. No, you do it because you are somebody who says, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, and because of that, I have a love for you. And the final action is, وَأَنْ يَكْرَهَ أَنْ يَعُودَ فِي الْكُفْرِ كَمَا يَكْرَهُ أَنْ يُقْذَفَ فِي النَّارِ. That the person has to believe that I have found guidance and I don't ever want to go back to a state of misguidance. These are three seemingly very simple actions. Believe in Allah, love Him and His Messenger more than you love yourself. To love your brother more than you love yourself. And to walk this path, this deen, with a fervor that says, I wish to never go backward. I wish to never be led astray. But that might seem a little bit difficult to access. They sound easy, but let's see how they play out in the life of one individual. The life of Shaykh Salih Al-Ja'fari. Shaykh Salih Al-Ja'fari was a scholar who lived not very long ago. He passed away actually just about 50 years ago. And when he compiled his 40 ahadith, the first hadith that he started with was the one that we just mentioned. The first hadith that he compiled in his 40 ahadith was the hadith that we just mentioned. Just as we know Imam Nawawi, when he compiled his Al-Arba'in al-Nawawiyya, his first was about the intention. But the first that Shaykh Salih started with was how to taste the flavor of Iman. And so let's look at his story and understand what happened in Shaykh Salih's life that allowed him to taste that Iman, and what can we do now that we're outside the month of Ramadan to have that flavor too. Shaykh Salih was born in 1907, just 100 plus years ago, in a humble city of Dongola in Sudan. And he was born, actually his birth was an answered dua. His mother and father, Muhammad and Zainab, were trying to have children for 8 years. Until it got to the point where Muhammad's family said to him, it's been 8 years, you guys have been trying and it hasn't worked out. Maybe it's time, Muhammad, for you to go and look for another wife who can give you children. And so Zainab became very worried. She went to the masjid and she made a sincere dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in her dua, she made 2 commitments. She said, Ya Allah, bless me with a child, and in return, I will not only fast the 6 days of Shawwal, which is one of her commitments, but in addition, when the people come and fill this masjid in the seasons of worship, I will help them and I will support them, I will clothe them, I will feed them. If people came and they're homeless, then they will sleep in my home. I will take care of the people that came to worship you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed her with a child. And when he was born, they discovered that he was a boy. And they were so happy. Muhammad takes his son, his newborn son, to his father. His father's name was Salih. And he says, I want to name my son after you. And so Salih, the grandfather, says, I'm a scholar. And I tell you, if you name your son after me, if you give him my name, then you are giving him as a commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he will be in the khidmah, in the worship, in the service of Allah, and he will have no desire for anything else. You won't be able to use him in the marketplace. You won't be able to use him to tend your land. He will be for Allah. But Muhammad and Zahra were so happy. They said, yes, we will name him Salih. This was his birth. He grew up in a humble city in Dongola. And throughout his early years, we see something happen in his life that for me reminds me of what happens in our lives in the month of Ramadan. In the month of Ramadan, we become obsessed with the Quran. We want to be in Taraweeh. We want to be listening to the Shaykh. When we're not here in Taraweeh, it's playing in our car. We want to consume Quran. And we want to also be in dhikr. We start to make dua. We start to be in dhikr. We start to say, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, Allahumma innaka afoon, tuhibbul afwa fa'fu anna. We make tons of dhikr. This was the reality of his first 20 years. When he reached the age of 10 years old, Salih with his father said, you know, it's time, you're 10 years old, it's time for you to put in some work. It's time for you to put in some earning. I can't just have you, running around the house anymore. Come work with me in the shop. So Salih would go with his father. And his father was a businessman. He bought and sold goods. He bought and sold goods. So Salih comes to work with his father and he finds it very distasteful. As a matter of fact, he gives cheaper rates than the items that were than the value of the purchase. So he's selling items at a loss because he looks at people and he says, this person, they're poor. I know they're poor. I'll give them a discount. This person is needy. I'll give them for free. This is a 10-year-old boy. And his father looks at him and says, what are you doing? I'm here to teach you business. I'm not here to give stuff away. What are you doing? So Salih becomes bothered with the marketplace. And he escapes where? He escapes to the masjid. He goes and finds solace in the masjid and in the qira'ah of the Quran, and he starts to memorize. And his father becomes more agitated. He said, I've invested 10 years into you. I need to see some return on my investment. And so his father, Muhammad, comes into the masjid looking for Salih, and he finds him and he's about to grab him and pull him outside of the masjid where the imam stops him. And he says, oh Muhammad, don't you remember that when you named him Salih, you made a commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you would give him up for the worship of Allah? And so Muhammad remembered the commitment that he made 10 years ago. And he left him in the masjid. And by the age of 14, Salih al-Ja'fari, young Salih, would have memorized the Quran in the masjid. And he would begin to study with his shaykh. His shaykh's name was Shaykh Muhammad, in that humble city in Dongola. And again, for me, I imagine this as being just a snippet of Ramadan for me. In Ramadan, I just want to be in the masjid. In Ramadan, I just want to be observing the Quran. In Ramadan, I just want to consume the Quran. That was his life. He reached the age of 16 and he had another incredible moment. At the age of 16, he and his brother needed to go and take care of some business in the outskirts of Dongola. He had never left the city up until this point. So he goes into this middle of this barren area where all he can see around him is shrubbery and hills and forests, and he is absolutely mortified. He's never been in a space where there wasn't a human being nearby or a building or something to protect him, and he's all on his own. His brother says, stay here, I'm going to leave, and I'll be back in a little while. His brother leaves, and he's gone for more than a little while. To the point that Salih says that I looked around and I would look in the distance and I would see a tree and I would become afraid of the tree because I thought that behind that tree was a wolf that was going to come and eat me. I was worried that under me there may be a scorpion that's going to come bite me. I became obsessed with the fear of what's behind these trees, what's behind the shrubbery. Suddenly the environment was very frightful. And then he thought to himself, I remember my teacher taught me that when I am afraid, that I should make tahleel, that I should say La ilaha illallah. And so he starts methodically, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, until he says two things happened. Number one, my heart started to go from being a space of fear to being consumed by joy and happiness and not feeling any sense of fear, just feeling secure. But the second thing that happened is that the trees that I was afraid of, I started to feel ease from. I actually felt that the world around me was making dhikr at the same time that I was making dhikr. And I started to feel that in the space that I was in, the plants and the trees and the shrubbery were encouraging me to make more dhikr. And so I stayed in that position until my brother finally remembered me. He came back and he said, I'm so sorry, I fell asleep and I just happened to be far away and it took me forever to come back. And he looked at his brother at the young age of 16 and he said to him, I wish that you had taken so much longer because I found happiness and joy where I am. This is what I think of when I think of the month of Ramadan. And for many of us, maybe we didn't have this amazing of an experience, but we had something that we felt in the month of Ramadan. But there would come a point in Shaykh Salih's life where he would have to leave this quiet solitude and he would have to experience the hustle and bustle and commotion that comes with being in a city. Just like we go through an experience where we have the quietude and the solitude and the joy of Ramadan, and then we leave and we have to deal with life's challenges and try to understand how we're going to wrap our minds around how to hold on to what we learned in Ramadan. So at the age of 20, Shaykh Salih is told, you have learned enough from me. It's time for you to journey 1,000 miles north to the blessed Al-Azhar Masjid and to study at the feet of the scholars in Al-Azhar. And so he gets on his horse or his mule and he makes the 1,000-mile journey. And what he finds in Cairo is devastating to him. In his mind, he was always taught by his grandfather and all of his teachers that Al-Azhar and the people of Al-Azhar are these magnanimous, wonderful, beautiful scholars. But he was worried because when he walked into Cairo, he didn't see Al-Azhar. He saw Cairo. He saw a huge city with bustling commotion, with people doing things, saying things, behaving in ways, dressing in ways that for him were antithetical to Islam. That he could not imagine that Al-Azhar Masjid that he had dreamed about is in the middle of this area that just seems to, in his mind to be, filthy and difficult and uncomfortable. And he started to worry about his heart. He started to think to himself, when I was quiet in a corner, when I was in my quiet corner worshiping Allah, my heart was filled with His love. I'm afraid that now that I step into this society that doesn't seem to care about Allah very much, that they're going to poison my heart. And so he goes to one of his teachers at Al-Azhar, Shaykh Al-Samanuti, and he sits with him for a while. And the Shaykh sees this discomfort in his heart. He sees that he's uncomfortable. And so he tells him, I want to correct something that you've misconstrued very much. You seem to think that spirituality is relegated to spiritual spaces. That if you're in the masjid, that's when you're spiritual. That if you're in the privacy of a cave, or if you're on your own, or if you're in quietude, that's where spirituality is found. No. The true spirituality is where you can have Allah in your heart with such fervor and confidence that you can walk among a field of scorpions and not feel the sting of a single one of them, because none of them will touch you when you hold Allah in your heart. Teaching him what? That you may feel that in the month of Ramadan and in the solitude of Ramadan, you can access Allah. But because the time after Ramadan doesn't have solitude, it doesn't have quiet, it doesn't have peace, that you can't access Allah? No, that's a faulty understanding of spirituality. As a matter of fact, you can hold on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This parable of the scorpion wasn't enough for Shaykh Salih. And for some of us, we may feel like, we want a little bit more. Tell me a little bit more about how I can hold on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Shaykh Salih stayed in Al-Azhar for 15 years until he felt that same feeling of, I feel uncomfortable. I feel like I want to know Allah better, and I need to go back to my quiet corner to have that reality. One of his other teachers saw this. He saw him preparing his material to go back to Sudan, and he said, wait, before you go, come to me tomorrow and bring me a dish, and we'll eat it together. As a farewell for me, come and have a dish with me. So Shaykh Salih goes to the marketplace, and he purchases a duck, and he goes and prepares it, and he cooks it the best way that he can, and he presents it to his teacher. And his teacher says, I've already eaten, so why don't you go ahead? Why don't you eat? Why don't you consume? And so Shaykh Salih begins to eat, and he consumes half of the duck, and his teacher tells him, continue. So Shaykh Salih tries, but he says, my teacher, I've already eaten half. I can feel I'm filling up. There's not too much space left. He takes a couple of more bites and he says, I can't. His teacher encourages him. He says, eat more. He says, I can't, I'm full. There's no room for even one bite, one morsel to fit. And so his teacher tells him, okay, now that you're completely consumed, why don't you go and buy some candy in the street and see if that can fit. He said, there's no way that anything else can fit. So his teacher taught him what? He said, your heart is just like this vessel. When you completely overfill it with love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you completely overfill it with the desire to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then nothing else can enter because it's already overflowing. Just like your stomach is filled up with this duck, your heart needs to be filled up with Allah to the extent that you cannot think of anyone else. You cannot consume anyone else. You cannot imagine anyone else. And so this is the crux of the moment in Shaykh Salih's life, where he finally said, I now know how to live spiritually outside of a spiritual setting. And this is the crux of the message for us. For us to truly access a spiritual, healthy life, it's to understand that it's not just about Ramadan. Ramadan is a nice crux, a nice crutch, a nice boost. It'll help you revive your heart. But if you want to keep that sweetness, that love, that flavor, that wonderful, wonderful, beautiful flavor in your heart, then all you need to do is fill your hearts with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which brings us back to that hadith. If you want the sweetness of Ramadan after the month of Ramadan has come to an end, there are 3 actions. The first is that you love Allah and His Messenger more than you love anything else. The second is that you love your brother because they are your brother in Islam. And the third is that you stick to the deen and you never try to go back to your old habits. This was what we learned from the life of Shaykh Salih Al-Ja'fari in his youth, in his middle age. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى. We spoke extensively about the past, about Ramadan and the time that follows after Ramadan. But now, as we reach the end of the month of Shawwal, and I hope that we all, as many as we could, observe the 6 days of Shawwal. As we reach the end of the month of Shawwal, we look ahead to the days of Dhul Qa'dah and Dhul Hijjah. I'll take a moment, as I've been reminded, to ask the brothers to come forward, because the back is filling up, so please do come forward to make space for the brothers who are coming a little bit later. Jazakumullah khair. So we looked back to the month of Ramadan, now looking ahead to the months of Dhul Qa'dah and Dhul Hijjah. There's one final part to the story of Shaykh Salih Al-Ja'fari that I wanted to share today as we look ahead to the days of Dhul Hijjah. As a reminder, the blessed nights of the year, the most blessed nights of the year are the nights of Ramadan. And the most blessed days of the year is the first 9 days of Dhul Hijjah. And so looking ahead to the days of Dhul Hijjah, and inshallah, hopefully there are some of us who will have the opportunity to visit the blessed Haram, and keep us all in your dua as you're visiting the blessed Haram, inshallah. Shaykh Salih, at the age of 50 years, finally had his first opportunity to do Hajj. And when he went to visit and do his tawaf, he found himself overcome with such love for being in the Haram that he grabbed onto the kiswa of the Kaaba and he made a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, Ya Allah, bring me back to Hajj every year. And for every year, for 27 years, Shaykh Salih Al-Ja'fari made Hajj to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the exception of 1 year. There was 1 year that Shaykh Salih was prevented from doing Hajj. That year was a year where he tried to go from Masr, from Cairo, to take the routes to get to Saudi Arabia, but unfortunately he was prevented for political reasons that was happening at the time. And so he said, okay, I can't go through Egypt. Why don't I go back to Sudan where I come from? Maybe I'll find a path from there. And so he goes to Sudan, and again he tries, and he's prevented. And so he says, okay, if I can't make Hajj this year, then at minimum I should spend this Eid with my family. And so he returns to Dongola and he goes back to his mother's house, and his mother looks at him and she says, did you think that you would make Hajj this year? And he said, yes, of course. I have been blessed to make Hajj every year. She said, no. I purchased a sheep last year with the intention that this year I would do udhiyah, I would slaughter it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you would be sitting here with me eating from the dish that I prepare. So there's no way that you could have gone to Hajj this year when I've already made this dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a lot to be said about the life of Shaykh Salih al-Ja'fari, about the dua of our parents, about the incredible beauty of the month of Dhul Hijjah that's upon us. But there's really a closing lesson that we have to take from his life, and that is the power of dua. Shaykh Salih's life started with a sincere dua from his mother. Shaykh Salih was blessed with going to Hajj every year with a sincere dua that he made. And Shaykh Salih was prevented from going to Hajj one year with a sincere dua that his mother made. And so the question for us is, we're outside of the month of Ramadan, but how often are we making these dua? I know I have needs. I have things that I need from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I need forgiveness. I need guidance. I need happiness. I need felicity. I need to know that He's pleased with me. Jalla fi'ulah. How many times am I asking that of Him? How many times am I seeking Him? How many times am I calling out to Him? And there are so many opportunities. This blessed day of Friday is a day of accepted dua. The time before Maghrib is a day of accepted dua. The time between adhan and iqamah is a time of accepted dua. There are so many opportunities for us. So even though we've left the month of Ramadan, and even though the month of Dhul Hijjah is far away, we still have a lot that we can do today. We can start with sincere dua, that Allah blesses us with those three traits that we talked about, with the trait of loving Him and the Prophet ﷺ more than anyone else, with the trait of loving our brother simply because they are our brother, and with the trait of walking this path of Islam and never getting off of the straight path. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us with guidance. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us love for the Prophet, to give us love for Allah, and to make us a people who love each other for His sake, to make us a people who walk His path, to make us a people who are always on His path. إني داع فآمنوا اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين اللهم لا تدع في مقامنا الكريم هذا ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا دينا إلا فرجته ولا مريضا إلا شفيته ولا حاجة إلا قضيتها يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين فوق كل أرض وتحت كل سماء اللهم أيدهم بنصرك وزلزل الأرض من تحت أقدام أعدائهم وأعدائك يا أرحم الراحمين وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وأقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Make sure the lines in front of you are filled up. Before you straighten the lines in the back, make sure the lines in front of you are completely full. Allahu Akbar. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين سبح اسم ربك الأعلى الذي خلق فسوى والذي قدر فهدى والذي أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء أحوى سنقرئك فلا تنسى إلا ما شاء الله إنه يعلم الجهر وما يخفى ونيسرك لليسرى فذكر إن نفعت الذكرى سيذكر من يخشى ويتجنبها الأشقى الذي يصلى النار الكبرى ثم لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا قد أفلح من تزكى وذكر اسم ربه فصلى بل تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا والآخرة خير وأبقى إن هذا لفي الصحف الأولى صحف إبراهيم وموسى. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.